Good morning. Today we're going to start the Vietnam War. This is going to be a topic that we're going to be on for the next 2 weeks. And after that, we have the 1970s and 80s. And I believe that's as far as we'll push through this semester. So without further ado, the Vietnam War. So Vietnam, how did it start? How did the United States get involved in Vietnam? Well, you guys started talking about the Cold War a couple weeks ago with Mr. G, and he started going over U.S. policy with communism spreading after World War II and the Vietnam War. One of the big factors that led to the Vietnam War has to do with the idea of containment, the U.S. policy of not allowing communism to spread any further. Well, containment did start in Europe, but we're going to see how it works in Asia as well. The United States had previously been involved in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, and that escalation ended pretty much in a stalemate with a ceasefire in 1953. So Vietnam's going to kind of escalate the same way. If you take a look at Vietnam, its overview. It was divided into two states. It was divided into the North and South, the North being communist, the South being non-communist. We don't want to say that the South was democratic. We'll kind of categorize them just as a non-communist government with a dictator, Ngo Dinh Diem, who we'll talk about a little bit further down the road. So at one point, we had 500,000 troops in Vietnam. That escalated from 16,000 when Kennedy had sent advisors in 61, all the way to 50,000 when Johnson sent 50,000 to Da Nang, and then 500,000 before President Nixon began to withdraw from Vietnam. So the war ends for us with a ceasefire, but definitely was not considered a victory. It was a very um, polarized war for the country and very unpopular in many cases. So Vietnam, it's in Southeast Asia. It's next to Laos and Cambodia. It's very rich in coal, iron ore, petroleum, rubber, mercury, and tin. Um, Starting in 1858, the French colonized Vietnam. Much like the rest of Southeast Asia, the French were a very big presence there, exploiting those resources that we just talked about in the last slide. The region becomes known as Indochina. We'll talk about Ho Chi Minh in just a minute or two. He's going to be the leader of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, and he is going to begin to revolt against the French presence in Vietnam and other areas of South Indochina. So 1940, Japan seizes Vietnam, just like they did many of the other areas of the Pacific. And Ho Chi Minh, who was brought up disliking foreigners at a very early age, traveled abroad, became a member of the Communist Party early in his life, and brought these ideas back to Vietnam. And he's going to lead the resistance against the French, the Japanese, and then against the French again. He forms something called the Viet Minh, an independence league. So 1945, Japan surrenders, and the result is everybody thinks that Vietnam, because they helped out against the Japanese, that the Allies were going to help free it. Well, that doesn't happen. It's returned back to the French, and this bitter animosity between Ho Chi Minh and the West begins. Now, these Viet Minh are able to recruit a lot of Vietnamese, and they form their own army. And in 1954, this army was so resilient that they were able to defeat the French at a very famous battle called Dien Bien Phu. So the French are going to be ousted after Dien Bien Phu. So this is kind of when U.S. intervention really starts to begin. We didn't want the whole country to become communist, so we kind of influence at the Geneva Conference in 1954 that Vietnam become divided, and that it's divided at the 17th parallel, like Korea, the North being communist, the South being non-communist, and we kind of intervened and said that, give it a year and we'll see what happens in a year. And in 1955, we'll allow free elections in the country, and the people themselves can decide whether or not they want to be communist or non-communist. So this all was based on the factor that if one country fell to communism, other countries would fall. So our job was to prevent. And this theory was known as the domino theory, that if one country falls to communism, its neighbors will fall. So the result of this was the 1954 peace conference, the Geneva Accords, to divide Vietnam and Indochina at the 17th parallel. The North Vietnamese are going to be led by Ho Chi Minh and the communist forces. They'll be supported by the Soviet Union and China. We have the South, again, who are not democratic, but are anti-communists under the rule of Ngo Dinh Diem. And you can see the two leaders here, right? You can see how Ho Chi Minh was the leader of forces of the North, and Diem was leader of the South. Now, Ho Chi Minh is going to become extremely popular amongst pretty much all Vietnamese, whereas Diem is going to be considered a brutal dictator that does a couple things that were very inexcusable. So Vietnam, as we move on, the United States is going to begin to get stuck there with this policy of not wanting the dominoes to fall, and sometimes referred to as a quagmire. Not the quagmire from Family Guy, but the quagmire that you can get stuck in. And France warns the United States to stay out. So, policy of the 1950s and 60s. We continue to back Diem's anti-communist regime. We know he's a brutal dictator, but we know he's anti-communist. This is going to continue through Eisenhower's administration into Kennedy's administration. Kennedy, as the North becomes stronger, and they begin to form the People's National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, Kennedy is going to be forced to send advisors into Vietnam, into the South, to train them. So really, Kennedy is going to be one of your first presidents that escalate the war by sending troops. So just a little bit about Diem. He was a Catholic, and he believed that everybody in Vietnam should be Catholic. Problem was there was a very large Buddhist population, and Diem believed that most Buddhists were communists, which they weren't. They were Buddhists, but he began attacking them. And in massive protests, we have the Buddhist monks in the late 50s and early 60s beginning self-immolation to protest what were known as strategic hamlets. Diem would put his people in pretty much prison camps to make sure they weren't getting out and they weren't joining Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, or now the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong. So there's a picture of a Buddhist self-immolating himself to protest the corrupt regime of Diem. Yes, that there's no survival once you start self-immolation. So what's going to happen is Diem is so unpopular and corrupt that the United States felt it was time to get rid of him, bring in somebody that might be a little bit more effective, less dictatorial. So in 1963, after the death of Kennedy, the Johnson administration, backed by the CIA, supports a coup of Diem, and he's going to be killed and replaced. One thing it's important to mention is this National Liberation Front. We'll call them Viet Cong, but they form in 1960. They support the communists. They are going to be from both North and South. And their goal is to rid Vietnam of the overall presence of Westerners who they believed were imperial, and unite the country under one communist government. One thing about these Viet Cong is they're very elusive. You don't know the difference between a villager and a member of the Viet Cong. So we'll talk about that in our next series of notes. So the U.S. increases the number of military advisors throughout the early 60s. We give the South government tanks, planes, troops, weapons, so on. So we're going to start to see the Soviet Union and China begin to step up their aid to the North. The North is going to receive weapons. They're going to transport those weapons from the North to the Viet Cong in the South, so they can be armed in their resistance through something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran outside in Cambodia and Laos and connected back up to the south. This way, Ho Chi Minh would receive weapons from the communist governments of China and the Soviet Union, get those weapons, and then supply the South. So, as you'll see in the 3-minute film that I attached for your daily activity question, that the United States wanted to bolster this war, wanted to commit even further into the war. However, knowing that there was really no explanation, that Congress wouldn't grant a declaration of war just to prevent communism. So something had to happen where we were provoked. And in August of 1964, 2 ships that were on patrol outside of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin were supposedly attacked by the North Vietnamese. Was never proven that those attacks actually happened. So once our ships were attacked, right here, Johnson is going to ask Congress for a blank check. He basically says to Congress on August 5th that the North Vietnamese regime has conducted further and deliberate attacks against the U.S. naval vessels operating in international waters. These latest actions of the North Vietnamese regime has given a new and grave turn to the already serious situation in Southeast Asia, and I want to ask Congress for a resolution expressing the unified determination of the United States in supporting freedom and protecting the peace of Southeast Asia. So Johnson is going to ask Congress for a declaration of war. So what Congress does, instead of declaring war, is it gives Johnson executive powers over the military. And this is done through something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Basically, it was a blank check that Congress gave Johnson to commit troops into Vietnam. And it all happens after the attack on those 2 ships. So we're going to see from 61 to 64, we're going to see 16 to 20,000 troops in Vietnam. Then we'll see 50,000 troops in Vietnam after 65, after the landing of Da Nang. And we'll see 500,000 troops by 1968. So after the resolution was approved by Congress, Johnson is going to send 50,000 Marines into Da Nang. This was done without a declaration of war. This was something that was questioned in our history as far as how broad executive powers go when committing troops overseas, and it's going to change legislation down the road. We'll have something called the War Powers Act, which limits the power of the president, so he can't do this again. So after Da Nang, Johnson begins to try to get the North to negotiate. He wants to unify the country as one non-communist government. So he begins in 1965 Operation Rolling Thunder, this heavy bombardment of the North to try to get the North Vietnamese to the negotiation table. This does nothing. And then a credibility gap begins to surge in the United States. Basically, the government was saying that we were winning the war in Vietnam and wrapping things up, and we were falling further and further into the war, getting ourselves deeper into that quagmire that I had mentioned. So, just to recap, 1858 to 1940, we see Vietnam and South Indochina controlled by France because of its rich resources. In 1940, Japan takes over Vietnam. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh forms the Viet Minh, the resistance group against imperial powers. 1945, France retakes Vietnam. 1954, France is defeated at Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Convention divides Vietnam at the 17th parallel. And between 55 and 63, U.S. increases aid to the southern government of Ngo Dinh Diem. 1960, the National Liberation Front forms. The basically your everyday people, villagers that supported Ho Chi Minh's North, even if they lived in the South, the VC or Viet Cong. 1964, we have the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, LBJ's blank check from Congress to escalate the war after the attack on the Maddox and Joy, the supposed attacks, I should say. And then in 1965, LBJ sends 50,000 troops into Vietnam. So I hope you enjoyed this. We're like, again, I said we're going to spend a little bit of time in Vietnam this week and next week, and I will talk to you soon. Log on tomorrow for office hours. Take care.